Greetings, Authenticate attendees. My name is Rolf Lindemann. I'm the VP Products at Knock Knock, an authentication solution provider who has worked with companies around the globe to tackle the question, how do I move beyond passwords? And in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to share how you can migrate off passwords and give you real-world examples of best practices from major brands that have taken the journey and are reaping the rewards of a modern approach to authentication. So we are going to start with a brief overview on why we need a change and why FIDO-based approach is a way to move off of legacy authentication. I'll outline some best practices for making the transition based on real-world experiences. And this is not a technical discussion. So we don't go into the bits and bytes of FIDO. Instead, this is a business discussion around the approaches for migrating to a strong passwordless solution. And my colleague Jackie will then go through 4 examples of customers who have successfully made that journey. Your customers likely authenticate to your digital services in many different ways, through mobile apps, mobile browsers, browsers on PCs, tablets, and maybe even kiosk PCs. Unlike with employees, organizations don't control what devices consumers use. So you have to accept and live with whatever your customer has in hands. To try to make it more convenient, many organizations have enabled biometrics on mobile devices through native APIs like Touch ID or Face ID. But you can't use Touch ID consistently via mobile web browsers on iOS or Android. So depending on the devices the customers are using and whether they are using a mobile app, a web app, after clicking next, the user experience is different today and often reverts to a password. That adds friction. So what you want in the future is to have a very similar user experience like this, right? And more devices today are including platform authenticators, not only smartphones, but also tablets and PCs have support for fingerprint or facial recognition-based platform authenticators as a leading modality. And by leveraging these platform authenticators in a secure way, it is possible to deliver a consistent and secure passwordless experience across devices and across different digital channels. So then when you click next, you're really prompted to use an authenticator on your device in exactly the same way the authenticator will ask you and prompt you typically. No more passwords. And I suspect you don't need to be convinced that passwords are extremely problematic in today's highly digital world where everything authenticates. They pose major challenges to both users and businesses. Passwords were introduced 60 years ago to MIT's compatible time-sharing system as a way for users to hide away the files and programs they are working on from other users on the same machine. They were never designed for today's digital world. And today, we as users have way too many passwords to remember. No wonder that many of us recycle passwords, forget passwords, and use the same password across different accounts. But sharing passwords across multiple accounts is a problem, since all accounts will be affected if the password is stolen from a server or being phished. 2 billion passwords were stolen from servers already. Additionally, phishing is a major problem, and phishing is now becoming more targeted. Passwords are not for free. With at least 20% of help desk calls being attributed to password, they create direct costs, plus the time that users spend entering or resetting passwords, and of course, plus the damage that is created by the security issues resulting from password use. So all in all, good reasons to reduce our reliance on passwords. And with millions or even tens of millions of customers, how do you start the transition to passwordless? There are different ways. So would you try to minimize the use of passwords and mainly rely on traditional risk signals? Risk signals are an important ingredient in any security strategy, but they mean you only rely on calculations without having a strong claim. And how do you know that these signals have been computed as you expect on the client machine? Are you sure that the code to compute those signals was not tampered with? Think about that. This problem is much harder than you might expect. And there are many privacy implications with device fingerprinting as well. Or would you replace passwords with behavioral biometrics? There's value in interpreting behaviors, but again, it's a calculation versus a strong claim. Or would you issue traditional X509 client certificates to customers? An approach that was tried 20 years ago and was not widely adopted because browsers don't support an acceptable user interface for certificate enrollment and certificate selection. And smart cards that you might want to use for better security don't work well with mobile devices. Or finally, would you give hardware tokens to every one of your customers? This may be attractive for a percentage of your user base, but not practical for most of them. Note that this talk is about customer authentication and not about workforce authentication. So we have to live with whatever devices the customers have in their hands, and we have to respect the preferences of the customers. So what if you had an easy way to turn any existing device your customer has in hands today to use a convenient and strong multi-factor authenticator and then use that device to authenticate to your services? Well, the good news is that you can do that if you start with a FIDO-based solution. So why is FIDO the right foundation for a next generation passwordless approach? First, it's a standard that has been adopted by the industry. All major platform vendors are members of the FIDO Alliance, like Google, Microsoft, Mozilla, and finally also Apple joined the FIDO Alliance. Think of what SSL did for e-commerce by introducing a standards-based approach to trust websites. FIDO brings a standard approach for trusting users and their devices. There is an immediate cost benefit by leveraging a standard versus implementing something proprietary. Secondly, it's secure. It uses public key cryptography, and only public keys are stored on the server. This means that there are no secrets that could be stolen from your server. Additionally, it cannot be phished, as a platform automatically selects the credential related to the specific relying party. FIDO-based authentication protects against the scalable attacks, making authentication appropriate for today's digital world. And it's privacy preserving, a growing concern with users and even the regulators these days. Any biometric templates are stored securely on the user's device and not on your server. And it's also cost effective. If you are going to change an architecture, you want the new one to last you into the future, which a standard gives you. And finally, it's convenient for users. Providing a single gesture is more convenient than entering passwords and waiting for OTPs. Plus, it gives users choice. Users can use an authenticator supporting their preferred biometrics or even non-biometric modality, like entering a PIN. Enabling your customers with access to your services quickly and conveniently across any device really is a game changer. Let's imagine a customer, let's call him Nico, that is first trying out our services through a browser on his smartphone. He registers a fingerprint-based authenticator, but never needs to give a new password during the onboarding process. And in many cases, that immediately avoids drop-off from password fatigue. Right? So since you're not asking the user to come up with something they have to remember or write down, right, it's easy, you can do those things on the go. Now, Nico becomes convinced that he likes your services and downloads your mobile app. His credential can be used, the credential established by the browser can now be used by the mobile app, and there's no need to re-register. He authenticates and is in. Very convenient. And later he decides to use do a more complex transaction on his PC or tablet. He can authenticate using his mobile device as his token, right? But since the platform authenticator is available on the device as well, he can use them directly for subsequent operations in the future. And then Nico's often on the go. He just wants to get the latest updates from your site without taking his phone out of his pocket. And this is typically the use case or the scenario as a driver for using smartwatches. He can access your services securely with his smartwatch, authenticating using FIDO to your backend system. Now, Nico's journey is complete, and he never had to use a password. As you look at starting your journey to passwordless authentication, there are various considerations for developing your strategy and approach. For example, what are the primary ways that your customers interact with your digital services? Are they using the mobile app first, the mobile web, or the desktop web, or are they doing both? Right? This depends really on your customer base, and you typically have statistics on that. Often companies have invested heavily in developing mobile applications and make it easy for customers to have optimal experiences and to engage more regularly through the device they always carry with them. And what are the various use cases you want to support? Is strong authentication, strong session authentication the only thing, or do you want to distinguish between basic authentication and step-up authentication? Or maybe you have a need for gathering explicit user consent, for example, for approving a high-value payment or otherwise high-value transaction. And finally, what will be your approach for migrating off your existing authentication methods? Where will you start? Will you make the new method optional or mandatory? How often do you want to remind a customer that there is a new, better way available that the customer could use? And what channels will you support, and how will you allow users to bootstrap new devices? In our experience working with major brands across the globe, organizations take a phased approach. They typically start with a mobile-first strategy. As I shared earlier, many organizations implement Touch ID on devices, but it's typically a single-factor authentication today, like a cached password or a cached OAuth token, right? And it's not consistently available via browsers. So most of our existing large-scale deployment used a mobile-first strategy by adding FIDO support to their mobile app through our app SDK. This secures your mobile app and turns the device into a strong multi-factor authenticator. Another major benefit is that it allows you to use the device for step-up authentication and to deprecate SMS OTP use. Large organizations then typically plan to support web authentication with FIDO2 while providing push notifications out of band alternatives for non-FIDO2 enabled users. And as a final phase, organizations have roadmaps to fully deprecate passwords and begin onboarding new users without any password. With a FIDO-based platform, phase 1 is just the beginning. With today's proprietary alternatives, it's often a dead end. Let's walk through each phase in a little bit more detail. A mobile-first approach has many benefits and offers an immediate ROI. You increase the security for anyone accessing your services through your mobile application. If you are currently using passwords, you dramatically improve the convenience. And this approach works on virtually all devices today. Right? Maybe not on feature phones and very old Androids and very old iOS devices, but in the end, that's less than 5% of the smartphones. If you're already using Touch ID today, you can even transition over to FIDO-based authentication transparently in the background, a feature Knock Knock offers. Now that you have turned your customer's device into a strong multi-factor authenticator, it can perform step-up authentication for other devices, removing the need to send an SMS OTP. And instead, you can send a push notification that the user only needs to swipe their finger. This can include transaction details, providing support for non-repudiation. And the secure token can serve as an authenticator to other devices, providing an easy way to offer passwordless authentication across digital channels. Authenticating a session on a PC browser using a mobile phone works and eliminates the need for passwords. However, it can be more convenient to leave the phone in the pocket and just authenticate using the PC's platform authenticator once it's available. Right? And this is now possible when you leverage FIDO2 or web authentication, which is available in all major browsers, including Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Mozilla Firefox, and even Apple has joined the FIDO Alliance and has added support for FIDO to Safari 14. Practically speaking, it means that you use your mobile phone to bootstrap the PC as a new device and then register the PC's platform authenticator via the browser. So for subsequent logins, you just need to use this authenticator on your device. Today, this approach is supported on Windows 10, modern Android devices, meaning Android 7 and newer, and on iOS 14 and newer. Even today, that gives you more than 50% market reach for these capabilities on PC web, and with the recent iOS 14 and Safari 14 support, the reach is now getting towards 70% on the mobile web. And with that, you're well into your journey to phase 3. The final phase is really to get rid of passwords and begin onboarding new users without ever requiring a password. To be able to reach this stage, you will want the ability to easily bootstrap new devices across platforms. This avoids the need for your customers to go through an onboarding process for each device. Instead, one registered authenticator can be used to onboard a new device, making it easy and safe to access your services through any channel. Most users will end up with several registered authenticators, for example, their mobile phone, their PC, the tablet, each of which can be used to set up an authenticator on another device. And in the event that your customer no longer has access to a registered authenticator because they only use their smartphone and it's lost and stolen, you will want a solution for account recovery. Right? With registering and suggesting the registration of multiple authenticators, you have a solution for that. It's much easier than for the user to recover from a loss of a smartphone via the existing authenticator on a PC or the tablet. And depending on your industry or product offering, this could be through remote ID proofing, through email or SMS OTP, in the case the customer has no registered authenticator left, right? Which you want to avoid typically because it's more expensive for you. It typically leads to more support calls and it's more cumbersome for the user to do. And a platform like Knock Knock's platform provides you with all these capabilities, supporting through all phases of your journey. Okay, with that, I want to hand over to my colleague Jackie, and she will walk you through all the real-world example. So Jackie, over to you.
Great, thanks, Rolf. Again, I'm Jackie Komp. I run sales at Knock Knock, and I've worked closely with our customers who've been thought leaders in adopting FIDO and are now on their way to deprecating passwords. So I am going to share 4 of those customer journeys with you. The first customer is NTT DOCOMO, a leading mobile network operator in Japan and a thought leader in their industry. They're a really great example of this phased approach that Rolf just shared with you. They started with their mobile app, mobile first strategy, and the goal was really to simplify the user experience and improve security on their mobile devices. So this was their phase 1. NTT DOCOMO provides an ID to their customers called D-account. It's used for a variety of purposes, such as accessing DOCOMO services, online shopping. In 2015, they planned to launch the first ever smartphone with iris recognition. And at that time, they decided to leverage FIDO because it's independent of the type of biometric sensor that's used to verify the user. So this enabled them to equip their smartphones with both iris and fingerprint sensors, really giving their users choice. So they launched their FIDO biometric in their mobile app to access this D account under the tagline, "Your security, more simple." It was extremely well received. And then they started moving into their phase 2. They introduced another concept, which was smartphone as your key to life. So in essence, the phone became a secure token for easily authenticating to other devices. Authentication by your smartphone was launched in January of 2017 and allowed users to authenticate to other devices, such as their PCs, set-top boxes, all using their smartphone. Extremely convenient. During this phase, DOCOMO then extended FIDO authentication for their users to third parties. So FIDO authentication is designed to work with ID federation technologies such as OpenID Connect. Leveraging OpenID Connect, DOCOMO was able to support their partner companies. So DOCOMO now impressively offers carrier billing to over 700 service providers. So you can go in, use your phone and order pizza. Finally, in their phase 3, which was launched in March of this year, they have enabled a completely passwordless experience. Users can even completely disable passwords from their D account. They can onboard new users without passwords. And they've even eliminated when you decide not to use a password or you're onboarded without a password, they've even eliminated the password input field on authentication screens. So, one of the considerations when we think of best practices for them to go entirely passwordless was how to migrate from this kind of biometric plus password authentication world to passwordless only. They had completed a survey that at the time said that 30% of their users really didn't want to use the biometrics. So it was necessary to prepare alternate ways for these users. So as an alternative, they do provide the ability to use like the local PIN or password that's used to unlock the screen. And this also leverages FIDO, so it's also secure, meaning that they've provided these alternatives in a way where there are no shared secrets still on the server. So the end result is that NTT DOCOMO users no longer have to worry about unauthorized access to their D account, and they have this incredibly easy to use experience. Intuit is another example of a forward-thinking team who recognized early on that using a FIDO-based platform is an effective and future-proof authentication strategy. So many of you might know Intuit as a major financial services company. They have well-known products like TurboTax, QuickBooks, and Mint. Passwords were a big issue for them, especially with a product like TurboTax, because you usually don't use it all year until it's tax season. And then, of course, everybody forgets their passwords. So the product teams were each kind of looking at implementing alternative approaches, and the identity team wanted to standardize the approach. After doing their research, they became convinced that FIDO was the right architecture. They did a build versus buy analysis and determined that developing internal expertise to build and maintain a FIDO solution was really not part of their core and not something that they wanted to use their developers and engineers for, and that it was more cost effective for them to partner. So once they did that, then they launched an internal educational program. They actually created a video, and the purpose was to educate the various stakeholders on this new approach. They explained how it's different from using approaches that some of the teams might already been trying, like, Touch ID, which might just really unlock a password, as Rolf was sharing earlier. So this is really kind of another best practice to think about, is how you get alignment across your organization so that they understand the value of why you're migrating to this new and new paradigm and moving away from legacy authentication. Finally, Intuit carefully mapped out their user journeys, and they started their deployment with iOS first. It was wildly successful, so then they opened it up to their Android devices, and now they've successfully deployed FIDO across many of their business applications with really astounding improvements and results. Their authentication success rate improved to almost 100%, just a huge improvement over SMS OTP. They had a reduction in login times by 78%. They are now reporting reduced fraud due to shorter session times. And their login success has increased by 6%, which they said when even moving the needle 1% was very difficult. They also shared that they were able to retire their old proprietary processes, which has saved them a lot on operational costs. So Intuit is continuing to leverage FIDO in things like improved onboarding and expanding the passwordless experience across other channels. T-Mobile was also an early adopter of FIDO, who started their mobile-first implementation with their My T-Mobile app. Many of you who are My T-Mobile users might not realize when you're logging in, you're actually logging in with FIDO. Their primary objective was to really simplify the user experience on mobile devices. Like Intuit, they started their implementation by really carefully mapping out their use cases. Again, a best practice. They wanted to have alignment on even things like terminology, the difference between somebody being enabled, registered, enrolled, and really understanding what that means. They then embarked on a 6-month project that included integrating with their in-house IDP and launched FIDO. Different from Intuit, when they rolled it out, they actually started with Android first. And they did this because they wanted to control it and do it in waves of 1 million users over a period of 1 month. Everything worked so smoothly that when they got to 20% of their target, they opened it up to everyone, including iOS users. And again, really dramatic results. They had 65% down to 7% decrease in password resets within the first 3 months, which resulted in a huge cost savings to the call center, and also shows you that the people who really hated passwords jumped on that because they, even with a very soft push, another kind of interesting best practice, they reminded users about once a month over a 4-month period. They achieved 50% of their target user base within the first 6 months. And then you saw the drastic reduction in password resets, which means that, again, a lot of the people who hated passwords jumped on that. T-Mobile also uses the FIDO-based platform for their 4-carrier initiative in the US. You might know it as Zenki. And they're now expanding the passwordless experience to additional channels. Again, once you get the framework in, it opens it up for you to continue to expand. And so they're looking at implementing this authentication, passwordless authentication into the call center through a push notification to the mobile device. You don't have to answer all those questions. And also enabling browser-based authentication. We started this presentation by asking you the question, what can you do now? How can you get started? And as we've demonstrated, moving to passwordless for your customers is not only possible, it is already practical. We also posed the question about how to accelerate your journey. So we've demonstrated how taking a phased approach, starting with a mobile-first strategy, is a first step that gets you started and gets many immediate results. You want to start with your high priority use cases, really identifying the goals and the results you want to achieve with your kind of full journey in mind. And then socialize this internally, get alignment from the various stakeholders. There's often, several groups within your organization that this touches and that are going to need to understand the benefits. And then look at your options. There are partners like Knock Knock and resources available to accelerate your path and who have done this before and have the best practices. And then take the time to build out the desired user experience as you're migrating. And then get started. Thank you very much.